Hey, well, it gives me great pleasure tonight to welcome Luan Roberts to join our group. I had a wonderful hour or two with her in Horseshoe Bay last September, where we were leaning over docks and looking for things. Unfortunately, we didn't find much that was, how would you say it, special, but definitely saw some things. And she was teaching me a little bit about her technique of how she goes about all of her fun stuff that she's going to show you tonight. So I'm really excited about that. So just a little bit of background about Luan. She is joining us tonight from the Seattle area. Education-wise, she has a Master of Arts in Biology from Miami University and a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology from the University of Houston. She works as an e-commerce team leader at Whole Foods Market in Belleville, Washington, but she spends her free time looking over the sides of docks and in the Intertidal for interesting creatures. She is a science communicator, having also just done the one-day university for sound water stewards, and definitely a sea slug hunter. So I will let her tell you so much more about all that. If you can hold your questions until the end, we'll get to them then, or put them in the chat and we'll attend to them after the end of the talk. Okay, Luan, over to you. Welcome.
Hello, I will attempt to share my screen now. Well, tonight I am going to be sharing with you about nudibranchs and my preferred way of observing them and having them in my life through my method of what I call dock fouling. I'm going to start with tide pooling. It's a lot more familiar to most people. Tide pooling is simply the activity of exploring what is left upon the beach or the shore when the tide recedes. And this occurs maybe a couple of times a month when you are able to access these tide pools. It's just simply the organisms that are left on the shore when the water recedes, and then the act of exploring them. When you look at tide pools, you are seeing all sorts of organisms that you normally would not be able to see or access because the water is receded. But these organisms aren't necessarily in their best showing state. They are in a state of distress because the water that they need is no longer there. They are exposed to elements such as the wind and the sun, and they're often scrunched up or trying to protect themselves, like these anemones that you see here. They recede in, so they don't look like they normally would when you would see them when the water was there. And tide pooling was a very intriguing activity to me for this reason, that you get to see all these super cool creatures that you wouldn't normally see. And when I started tide pooling, I wanted to get other people engaged and interested in it as a part of my degree. And at first, I didn't even know anything about nudibranchs when I started tide pooling. And it's because when you're tide pooling, nudibranchs look like the organisms on the top row. They are the same species as the images below them, but during low tide, as I said before, they're in a state of distress. So they're kind of shriveled up. You can't really identify a lot of features on them. So when I originally had seen nudibranchs, that this is what they looked like. When you observe them underwater, like on the row at the bottom, you can see a lot more of their features and characteristics, and they look a lot more interesting. At low tide, they can't really move about or do much of anything because they're not in the water. But when you see them under the water, they're much more exciting. And when you're tide pooling, you rarely get to see them in the water. So when I started seeing images of these creatures, these nudibranchs, when they were in the water, I was like, hey, what's going on here? These are really intriguing looking organisms, but they didn't really stand out at low tide. And when I started seeing images like this, they were in a context of people referring to dock fouling. And I had never heard of dock fouling before and didn't understand what that term meant. So thinking about nudibranchs, this is what they would typically look like under the water. I'm just going to give you a bit of background and context about nudibranchs and what these organisms are before talking more about how I'm observing them. Nudibranchs are shellless marine mollusks that range in size from a couple of millimeters to about 23 centimeters. So for Americans, that's about a foot. So they can get quite large. These creatures have unique anatomy. There's two basic body shapes that you would typically see around the Pacific Northwest. So from where I'm at all the way up north to Alaska, you have a more aelid body shape on the left, which is an elongated body with these flowing projections from the back called serrata, which are digestive glands and used for respiration. There's the rhinophores, the two projections off the top of their head, which are sensing organs, which we're not really sure how these function, but probably similar to a nostril being turned inside out. At the front, you have the oral tentacles, which again, the function is not completely understood, but it could be for feeling food or navigating their environment. The mantle is simply the center of the body, and the foot is underneath the creature. It's a very muscular foot that it can use to grip onto things. On the right, there's another kind of body plan of a nudibranch or sea slug. It has the rhinophores at the front, like the one on the left, but instead of having serrata for respiration, it has the anal gills, called so because they circle the anus. And these are parts of the slug that can be retracted into the body if they feel threatened. But then they retract out, or detract, I suppose, and they are these beautiful flowery shapes. And they also have a strong foot for gripping and crawling, just like the aelid body plan on the left. So kind of gives you an idea of this is what a nudibranch looks like. These are common body shapes for nudibranchs. This gives you a sense for the type of creature that I'm looking for primarily when I'm doing this activity. Now, dock fouling, okay, what is that? How am I seeing these creatures as they are more comfortably navigating their environment and not being deprived of water during low tide? It looks like this. I am simply laying on top of a floating dock, looking over the edge at the organisms that are growing on the side there. And you can access a lot of the same marine life that you would see in tide pools, with the additional bonus of seeing more organisms than would typically be able to survive in the intertidal zone. Because these docks are submerged in the water at all times, the creatures never need the capacity to really endure periods of extended time outside of the water. So you get to see all the organisms you would see in tide pools in a more comfortable environment for these creatures. And you get to see other organisms that also you wouldn't be able to see at all in tide pools because they simply wouldn't survive. Now, this activity I refer to as dock fouling, but dock fouling is a technical term, a scientific term that refers to the assemblages of organisms that adhere to and grow on artificial structures that are in the water, submerged in the water. So this could be a dock, this could be a float. Boats can gather fouling organisms, and they have this unusual name of fouling because they create an economic nuisance for whoever owns that piece of equipment that's submerged in the water. It's it's an unwanted presence of these creatures because they can cause damage to the structure, or if it's on something such as a boat, it can cause drag in the water and lead to additional fuel costs. Not only could they cause economic damage because of the nature of docks and these structures, it also can bring invasive organisms into the environment. This is an invasive organism of concern identified by the Invasive Species Council of Washington, which is a tunicate. It's a interesting organism that starts life with some vertebrate properties and then settles down in these colonies of organisms that share a circulatory and respiratory system. And this particular species gets brought in by boats, and it will grow on the docks, and it thrives really well. It doesn't have any predators, and it can coat the surface of a dock, or it can coat the ocean floor and prevent other organisms from growing there. So talking about these structures being submerged in the water, you think about, well, how long does something have to be there for it to become a nuisance? This is an image of me at Tacoma Boat Builders, where they very generously allowed me to tie different materials to the edge of their dock and leave them submerged in the water to see what happened. And in this photo, I have a long piece of webbing, which is basically a very flat rope that has been in there for, I put it in February of last year, and then I'm pulling it out in around May to see what organisms might have collected here. And this is what I saw. And you can see the piece of webbing here, and it's a very small nudibranch or sea slug, the horned nudibranch, Hermesenda crassicornis, one of the most prolific species out here, and it's nestled between a different type of tunicate, a solitary tunicate, another fouling organism. And this is an example of how quickly these organisms can move into the environment. It doesn't take long at all. So if you simply leave something in the water for a short period of time and make no efforts to keep it clean, then you might have a nudibranch farm after a short period. Nudibranchs also seem to do quite well on other types of man-made material. At one of the locations that I frequently visit, there's these styrofoam, I think of them as styrofoam sausages. They're just floating styrofoam with nets surrounding them that are up against the dock. And they're here to stop the boats from colliding into the dock directly. And I know they change them out fairly frequently, and it had been possibly less than a year of growth on this particular one. And below this net, you can see an organism called a bryozoa, and that's this nudibranch's food source. This is a white-lined dirona on the top of this net here. And what kind of fascinates me about this particular situation is when I'm moving these floats to check out the organisms on them, I can see fuel leaking from them into the water, and it fascinates me that these organisms seem to do just fine with all of these potentially hazardous and harmful contaminants in the water. This is another typical scene that you might see if you are dock fouling or looking over the edge of a floating dock. In the foreground, there are two, their common name is shagrug nudibranchs. They're difficult. There's a couple species and they're difficult to distinguish. So we usually use a common name, a shag rug or a gray mouse nudibranch. They're very common, especially this time of year. There's dozens and dozens of them in the docks, but I wanted to include this as an example of how it can be pretty confusing when you first look over the edge of a dock. This is a totally new landscape, and it's hard to kind of orient your eyes to what's going on. But you have the two slugs in the foreground, and then in the background, you have all these plumose anemones, which are the slug's food source. And this is just the surface that they're on is just the side of the dock. This is another example of what you might see and how to orient your eyes when you're looking over the edge of a floating dock. In this example, this photo is taken above the surface of the water. I'm just using my phone here. You can see my reflection. It's always a bit of a dangerous gamble taking your phone out for a photo. But on the left of this image, you can see more plumose anemones. And then there's this pipe running along the side of the dock. And in the center of the image is a giant nudibranch. And this nudibranch, I would want to say it was probably about 15 centimeters long. This one is exceptionally large compared to other species. But this is an example of how you are able to see quite a bit, and you are able to observe and pick out nudibranchs, but without having any kind of specialized equipment. So this is what the activity of dock fouling looks like. So you are very much just laying there on the side of the dock and looking over the edge at the creatures below you. This is a group of us here who went out. I started a BioBlitz to celebrate Docktober, which is just an entirely fabricated celebration. But the idea is to get as many observations from floating docks during the month of October and submit them to iNaturalist. And it's just something we started to do every year to get people excited and engaged and interested in it. And October is a great month of the year to start dock fouling, to start this activity, because during the summer you have all these consistent great low tides, and then as you start to go into the fall and winter months, they greatly diminish or at very inconvenient times of day. So it's a great time of year to start a new hobby of dock fouling. This is another example of what dock fouling can look like. This is me. I'm wearing some pants I acquired from the seafood department, very popular pants for fishermen. They're just rubber, and they serve a couple of purposes. It keeps me dry, but there's also lots of sharp and pokey objects on the dock, so it keeps those hazards off me too. And in this image, I'm looking at these nets that are submerged in the water, and these nets are the most fabulous things for finding organisms and nudibranchs, because they basically create a super highway for all these creatures to go from the bottom of the ocean to the surface of the net and take it over, and you can manipulate it and bring it close to you. And it's a really great way of being able to see a lot of creatures up close. The nice thing about dock fouling is that if you're careful about it, you don't even have to get wet, and it doesn't require a bunch of gear or coordination of time or expense. You don't have to be certified to do it. It's something that you can do with very low experience and low cost. If you were wanting to get started in participating in this activity, there's a few things that you can get that will make it a bit nicer for you. You can certainly just go out and lay down on a dock, but there, as I was saying before, there's lots of things on the dock you might not want to make contact with. So having a towel to lay on, some knee pads because you are kneeling up and down constantly. And if you really get into it, having an underwater camera is fantastic for documenting and making closer observations of the organisms that you'll see. The camera that I typically use is the Olympus TG6. There aren't many different options out there that that are waterproof and that you can take the really like up close macro images with. And most of everyone I know would use a TG6, but a Panasonic TS7 is very comparable to that. If you were just looking for a cheaper option, these two on the left are going to run you $400 to $500. So it's an investment for sure. And if you just wanted something cheap to try it out with, the Lumix you can buy for $100 or less. Panasonic on the right, but the image quality is pretty basic. But hey, if you accidentally drop it, it's not too terrible of a loss. One of the really appealing aspects to me about dock fouling, as I mentioned before, is it's different from tide pooling in that you can really go participate in it anytime. This is a tide chart, which if you're going to tide pool, there's a few different things to help you out there, apps to tell you when the tides are, but it really does require a bit of knowledge and timing. And if you aren't available at low tide, then you miss out on the experience. But if you're laying on a floating dock, you're moving up and down with the tide. So the experience might be slightly different depending on where low or high tide is in the day, but for the most part, you're going to be having the exact same experience. So as I was saying, you can go any time of night or day. You can see different organisms if you go at night, but it does require a bit of coordination, a headlamp perhaps, and just a bit more skill to get to see what you want to see, but it's definitely doable. It doesn't cost you much to get started with dock fouling. You could, if you are able to get to a marina, then you are able to get started with it. And what I really enjoy is not feeling rushed or not feeling like I'm going to miss out on something. It's a nice static environment for the most part. I'm not looking at my watch to see when the tide's going to come back in. I can just really lay there and observe things. Some things that might be unpleasant about it are the docks are, especially if you go first thing in the morning, they could be covered in seal poop or things that otters might leave behind, which are shell pieces, and they can be quite sharp and unpleasant. It doesn't have to be physically challenging, but it can be, especially if there's a very appealing piece of kelp that's just out of your reach. It requires a bit of acrobatics and care to remain on the top side of the dock. And I find that the conditions can be a little difficult to predict because while we typically think about rain, we don't necessarily think about what the wind might do or the chop on the water. And those are things that are difficult to predict and can diminish your experience because anything that creates movement on the surface of the water will make it more difficult for you to observe the organisms. The organisms themselves don't really mind. When you are experiencing this environment, it's important to think about the creatures that you are interacting with and to minimize that interaction. In this photo, I have a nudibranch in my hand. I wouldn't recommend that. It's one of those times where it ended up on me, but deliberately moving or prying, especially prying an organism from a surface, will likely result in its death because you are removing it from what it can eat and it won't necessarily ever be able to return to it. When you are out on a dock, doing this activity, it's very important to be respectful of the space that you're in and aware. Not all docks are publicly accessible. So just follow any posted rules, never go into a locked door. It's important to remember that people live in the boats that are docked at these marinas, and they also represent a significant investment. So just be respectful around people's property and be mindful of your surroundings. Now, how do I find the docks to see these organisms on? I use iNaturalist, which is a great website where you can upload observations of organisms, and community members will help you identify them. And how you would go about finding suitable docks or potentially suitable docks for this activity is to go on iNaturalist and just search for nudibranchs or another dock fouling species, and take a look at the map of observations and then coordinate that with where there are publicly accessible docks in your area. And that will give you a sense of where might be a good spot to find these creatures. There might already be people in your area who are looking at organisms this way, and you'll see from where their location markers are if they're on docks or not. Another consideration is seasonality. This is an example of a species page on iNaturalist for a giant nudibranch. And you can see the chart on the bottom right. It shows the quantity of observations throughout a yearly cycle. And this might give you a better sense of when might be a good time to go and try and observe nudibranchs and when might not. I came up to Vancouver last October and looked on multiple docks, and I only found 2 species of nudibranch, and I would be hesitant to discount the possibility of them out there based on that one time that I went. So this is an activity that requires persistence and a bit of knowledge. So I'm going to talk more a bit specifically about nudibranchs, and I've been using the term nudibranch and sea slug a bit interchangeably. And to be clear about what these terms mean, sea slug is a more general term for multiple different species, and nudibranchs are specific types of sea slugs, which are almost exclusively predators and have these interesting characteristics which make them intriguing to me. And they come in all these different body forms and shapes and colors. These are some of the typical species that I see and observe from docks around this area. A branch dendronotus on the top left. These are quite small and only will grow to be maybe 30 millimeters compared to on their right, this rainbow or giant nudibranch, which begins life at a couple millimeters and can get to be about 23 centimeters. It can be quite large. One very common slug is the Nanaimo horned dorid, which it has this amazing sparkle to it when the light hits its body, and they just look amazing when you photograph them. And they're a very common species in tide pools and on docks. On the bottom left, I simply labeled this one Eubranchus because the species out here haven't been quite narrowed down and defined, so I just stick with a more general term. And these are the types of nudibranchs that I was able to observe while I was out in Vancouver, and they are one of the most commonly found species for me on docks, at least. They're very tiny, but I can almost always find 1 or 2 members of that species on any of the docks I go to. I included the lion's mane nudibranch, the Melibea lyonia, in the bottom middle here as an example of how different some of the members of nudibranchs can look like. This is also quite a common species, and they are primarily found in not quite fresh kelp beds that have been growing for a little bit of time. On the top left, this is a very common species that I see throughout all year on almost every dock. They seem to have become even more popular this past year than the year before. The red-fingered coryphella. This is also another species where the scientific name is a bit in question. We have humptangula in the middle here, and then rose pink Cassona on the bottom left, and a Cassonella coquina in the bottom middle. I had only ever seen maybe one or two examples of those species. And on the bottom right, a Paleozorastra, which is a very odd looking slug. It looks very different from the rest that you see here. And I love it as an example of something that you could easily dismiss with your eyes. You would just see it as like a kind of a bump, but if you look at it closer, you can see the different features, the rosette of its anal gills on the back there. As I had mentioned before, all nudibranchs are predators. This is an image I took of two shagrug nudibranchs. It's kind of difficult to tell what's going on here. It's such an unusual scene. In the middle is their mouth parts. They have a specialized tongue with teeth on it called a radula that they use for scraping. And on the bottom, it looks very similar to their mouth parts, is a plumose anemone that they are both consuming. And this anemone has sent out stinging cells towards the nudibranchs to ward them off. But one special property of nudibranchs is they are immune to these stinging cells. So they are able to consume the anemone with no harm. And then they can store those cells in their serrata on those flowy bits projecting from them and use them for their own defense. Nudibranchs are all hermaphroditic, so any two members of the same species are able to reproduce simultaneously with each other. This is kind of what it looks like. They have their sex organs on the right, just behind their head area, and so they kind of pull up alongside each other, and I kind of think of it as docking. They kind of dock alongside each other and simultaneously reproduce. This is an example of a nudibranch with its eggs. It's kind of difficult to see what's happening here, but the white squiggle is the eggs, and directly above it is the sea slug. It's a corambi. There's actually two of them there next to each other, and they are on their food source, this kelp-lace bryozoa. And you can see how adapted they are to be camouflage on this organism, and they live on this organism that they consume. It is their only food source, and they also reproduce on it. And it is growing on a piece of kelp that is attached to a dock. You were able to see so many different and interesting organisms from the side of the docks. And I like to include this as a reminder to look up every now and then and to see what's going on around you. This is a type of sea slug, a non-nudibranch sea slug that I observed when dock fouling in Tacoma after there was a series of heavy storms. This was a very strange jellyfish-like creature that was swimming around in the water. And when we first saw it, we had no idea what it could be because it was moving with so much more intent than a jellyfish ever would. And the way that we went about identifying it was quite silly. We thought, well, what's a silly name that somebody might give this creature? And the person I was with said, oh, it's probably called something silly like a sea butterfly or a sea angel. And so we looked that up on our phones, and sure enough, it was something called a sea butterfly, which in itself is not a very unusual organism, but it was quite unusual that we were to observe it from the dock. It would be much further out in the ocean typically, and much deeper. But because of the storms, some of the water had washed it in, and we were able to observe it. And these are non-nudibranch sea slugs that are free swimming in the ocean, and they can live 1 to 2 years, and they swim around and they consume another type of sea slug that swims in the ocean. So it constantly amazes me what you were able to see when you have the persistence to go out. But it's always a good reminder to me that not just to look down, but to lift my head up and look around and see what's happening around me on the docks. This is another nudibranch, well, another sea slug, a nudibranch, the Polycera hedgepethy. And I wanted to mention it because it's an intriguing example of why docks specifically might hold a different interest than what you might see in a tide pool. This sea slug, this nudibranch, was originally described in California and was believed to be a species that was native to California. But observations of it after it had been described started popping up as far as Australia, and it was believed that that this species had been basically transported as an invasive species on a boat through a port, because the observations were popping up around the marinas. And if you go on to iNaturalist today and look up a world map of this species, you can see that it's very much concentrated in California, but there are observations all up and down the West Coast, all around Europe, and just kind of spread out across the entire globe, centered around ports. So this makes dock fouling especially intriguing, because you might see something that is not typically found in your area. You might be the first person to make that observation, and it might just pop up one day and disappear forever and not proliferate in its newfound home. But it also might be the first indicator of an invasive species that could potentially alter the ecosystem in which it found itself. So overall, dock fouling to me is very special, and I would love to encourage others to do it, because it's such a great way of making observations and being able to contribute to scientific knowledge, and to just be a part of a community of people who is excited about the environment. And it's a way of being able to connect to organisms that normally would not be accessible to you, that people don't typically even think about as being a part of their environment. And because it's such a little monitored area of interest, that there really is the possibility that you can make a new discovery, or you can definitely contribute to scientific knowledge as a whole, simply by observing and documenting or sharing those observations. And I just want to leave you with a few different resources about where you might be able to get connected to this community. There's a few of us that we just call ourselves the Dock Fowlers Union. If you are on Instagram, then if you just look at that hashtag, then you'll see a bunch of different people who are getting out and getting excited about what they see on the side of floating docks.